October 14th, 1943. 26,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The sky is a brilliant, merciless blue, but no one in the formation is admiring the view. You can almost feel the razor-sharp cold biting through the thin leather gloves of the B-17 gunners as their breath fogs inside the open waist positions. The thunder of 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines vibrates every rivet in the flying fortress named Yankee Doodle. Lead pilot Captain John Jack Justice keeps the big bomber steady on course, his knuckles white on the yoke, while the formation of 291 heavy bombers stretches out for miles behind him like a steel river in the sky. Below them, the German city of Schweinfurt appears as a hazy patchwork of factories and rooftops. The target today, the ball-bearing plants that feed the entire Nazi war machine. But the Luftwaffe knows they're coming. Black puffs of 88mm flak begin to bloom all around the formation, ugly, evil flowers that rock the plains with concussion waves. Shrapnel rattles against the aluminum skin like hail on a tin roof. One burst clips the tail of a nearby fortress, its rudder shreds, and the big bomber slides out of formation, trailing smoke. Then the fighters arrive. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s scream up from below in perfect coordination, their yellow noses flashing in the sun. German pilots, many of them veterans with iron crosses and kill tallies in the dozens, roll inverted and rake the American bombers with 20mm cannon fire. You hear the distinct brrrt of the guns cutting through the roar. A B-17 named Memphis Belle takes hits in the No. 2 engine. Flames lick back along the wing as the crew fights to feather the propeller. Another fortress simply vanishes in a blinding orange fireball, its bomb load detonating mid-air, sending twisted metal and burning crewmen tumbling toward the earth. Parachutes dot the sky like white dandelions, but not nearly enough. From the radio chatter you catch fragments. Bandits at 2 o'clock high. I'm hit! I'm hit! Oxygen system gone! Keep the formation tight, damn it! Colonel Curtis LeMay's iron discipline is the only thing holding the mission together, but even he cannot stop the slaughter. Wave after wave of German fighters press the attack for more than an hour. By the time the surviving bombers drop their loads and turn for home, the sky behind them is littered with burning wrecks. Back at bases in England that evening, the ground crews wait in the freezing fog. They count the returning aircraft. Out of 291 B-17s that took off, only 197 make it back. 60 bombers lost, more than 600 airmen dead, wounded, or captured. The mess halls that night are filled with empty chairs. Dog tags clink in a tin box on the chaplain's desk. The daylight bombing campaign, the great hope of the 8th Air Force, is bleeding out. Without fighter escorts that can fly all the way to the target and back, the bombers are sitting ducks. Deep raids into Germany are becoming suicide missions. Commanders stare at maps in dimly lit briefing rooms, faces gaunt under the glow of bare bulbs. The P-51 Mustang is already in England. Pilots rave about its speed and handling, but with the American Allison engine under the cowling, its range is a cruel joke, barely enough to skim the French coast before the fuel gauges scream empty. The sleek fighter sits on the tarmac at RAF Duxford, beautiful and useless, while the Luftwaffe still rules the skies over the Reich. The Allies are losing the air war. And then one man climbs into the cockpit of that very Mustang with an idea so simple, so audacious, it sounds like pure madness. The roar of the Schweinfurt raid still echoed through the Nissen huts and briefing rooms of the 8th Air Force when a lone P-51 Mustang sat quietly on the grass at RAF Duxford in early 1943. Morning mist clung to the English countryside as mechanics in oil-stained overalls wiped dew from the fighter's sleek laminar flow wings. The plane looked every bit the thoroughbred: long nose, bubble canopy, and those beautiful elliptical wings that promised speed. American pilots who had flown it in low-level sweeps over France came back grinning, calling it the sweetest handling fighter they had ever touched. But when the conversation turned to altitude and range, the grins faded. With the Allison V1710 engine fitted as standard, the Mustang gasped for breath above 15,000 feet. Its supercharger simply couldn't deliver the power needed in the thin, freezing air where the heavy bombers lived. Pilots watched their manifold pressure drop, their speed bleed away, and their fuel gauges fall far too quickly. A deep escort mission to Berlin? Impossible. The plane could barely reach the outer edges of occupied France and limp home with dry tanks. Senior officers shook their heads. "Nice toy," one colonel muttered during a test flight debrief, "but we need killers that can stay with the forts all the way to the target." The Mustang seemed destined to spend the war on short-range tactical missions, while the real work, clearing the path to Germany, fell to shorter-legged Spitfires and Thunderbolts that still couldn't go far enough. Yet on that quiet spring morning in 1942, a British test pilot named Ronnie Harker walked across the damp grass toward the parked Mustang. Wing Commander Ronnie Harker was no stranger to unconventional ideas. He had flown Spitfires in the Battle of Britain, tested captured German fighters, and earned a reputation for seeing possibilities where others saw problems. The RAF had borrowed this particular Mustang for evaluation, hoping it might help in some secondary role. Harker climbed into the cockpit, adjusted his parachute straps, and ran through the startup checklist with calm precision. The Allison engine coughed to life, its exhaust stacks barking in the cold air. He taxied out, lined up on the runway, and pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang surged ahead, lifted off gracefully, and climbed into the overcast English sky. At low altitude, the plane felt magnificent, responsive, fast, almost playful in his hands. But as Harker pushed higher, the familiar disappointment set in. The engine labored, speed fell off. He leveled out at 20,000 feet and felt the fighter struggling like a thoroughbred asked to run with a broken leg. He brought the Mustang back down, landed smoothly, and taxied back to the dispersal area. Mechanics swarmed around as he cut the engine. Harker sat for a moment in the cockpit, staring at the instrument panel, then climbed out and wiped his hands on a rag. The RAF engineers gathered around expectantly. Harker looked at the long-nosed fighter, then spoke the words that would rewrite the air war over Europe. "Why don't we try fitting it with a Rolls-Royce Merlin?" The suggestion hung in the damp English air. A few engineers chuckled nervously. Swap a British engine into an American airframe? The Merlin was already legendary, powering the Spitfire and Hurricane that saved Britain in 1940. But bolting it into this untried Yankee fighter sounded like workshop madness. Logistics, cooling systems, propeller gearing, everything would need reworking. Yet Harker wasn't joking. He knew the Merlin's two-stage, two-speed supercharger gave it devastating performance at high altitude. If the Mustang could inherit that power, the idea seemed crazy. But what if it worked? The words hung in the cold English air like a challenge no one dared refuse. Within days, the ground crew at Duxford began the audacious swap. Mechanics worked under floodlights in the damp hangars, unbolting the American Allison V-1710 and carefully lifting out the heavy engine block. In its place, they lowered a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same powerful V-12 that had turned the Spitfire into a high-altitude killer. Pipes, wiring, and coolant lines were rerouted. A new four-bladed propeller was fitted, and extra fuel tanks were added to the wings to test the limits of endurance. Ronnie Harker watched the modifications with quiet intensity, pipe clenched between his teeth. Engineers warned him the conversion was experimental at best. Cooling problems could overheat the engine. The center of gravity might shift dangerously. But Harker simply nodded and waited for the moment he could fly it again. The day of the first Merlin-powered test flight dawned gray and windy. Harker strapped himself into the cockpit of the modified Mustang, now unofficially christened the Mustang X by the British. He ran through the checks, the Merlin's characteristic growl replacing the Allison's bark. The exhaust stacks crackled with that deep, throaty note every RAF pilot knew meant power. He opened the throttle. The fighter surged down the runway and leaped into the sky with renewed fury. As Harker climbed, something magical happened. At 15,000 feet, the plane kept accelerating instead of fading. At 20,000 feet, it was still strong. At 30,000 feet, the Merlin was singing, delivering full power where the Allison had gasped. The Mustang sliced through the thin air like it belonged there, responsive and eager. Harker pushed the nose over into a gentle dive and felt the fighter accelerate smoothly past 400 miles per hour. He leveled out and began range tests, flying long circuits over the English countryside. When he finally touched down after nearly 5 hours in the air, the ground crew rushed forward. Harker climbed out, face flushed with excitement, and delivered the verdict that would change everything. This aircraft now has the range and performance to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Word spread like wildfire through the Allied air commands. American officers who had dismissed the Mustang as a pretty but short-legged toy suddenly demanded demonstrations. North American aviation engineers in California were stunned when they received the British test data. What had been a promising low-level fighter was transforming into a long-range, high-altitude champion. Production lines were hastily adjusted. The new P-51B and later the bubble canopy P-51D versions began rolling out with the Merlin engine under the cowling. Pilots transitioning from Thunderbolts and Lightnings couldn't believe the difference. The Mustang could now fly over 1,600 miles on internal and drop tanks, more than enough to reach deep into Germany, loiter over the target, and return home with fuel to spare. Its speed at altitude topped 440 miles per hour, and it could climb and turn with the best German fighters. The once-forgotten fighter was reborn. But theory on a test range was one thing. Proving it in the lethal skies over the Reich would be something else entirely. Would the Merlin Mustang live up to its promise when the Luftwaffe came hunting?
The first combat-ready Merlin-powered Mustangs arrived in England in late 1943, just as the 8th Air Force teetered on the edge of disaster. By early 1944, the transformation was complete. Squadrons of the 4th Fighter Group and the 357th Fighter Group traded in their shorter-legged Thunderbolts and Lightnings for the sleek P-51Ds. Pilots fresh from training in the States climbed into the cockpits, adjusted their oxygen masks, and felt the raw power of the Merlin engine rumble through the airframe. The big Packard-built Merlins, license-produced in America, growled with authority as the fighters taxied out in long lines, their invasion stripes freshly painted for the coming invasion of Europe. On February 20th, 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, a massive, coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s droned eastward in tight combat boxes, their contrails carving white scars across the sky. This time, however, they were not alone. High above and slightly ahead, the P-51 Mustangs flew as never before. At 28,000 to 32,000 feet, the Merlin engines delivered crisp, responsive power. The fighters could stay with the bomber stream all the way to the targets deep in central Germany, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Augsburg, and even Berlin itself. German radar operators stared at their screens in growing alarm as the new American escorts appeared far deeper into Reich airspace than ever before. When the Luftwaffe rose to intercept, they met a deadly surprise. Yellow-nosed FW-190s and Bf-109Gs climbed aggressively, expecting the usual short-legged escorts to turn back at the German border. Instead, the Mustangs stayed. They dropped their auxiliary tanks, rolled into perfect firing positions, and dove with terrifying speed. The 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns in each Mustang's wings spat long, hammering streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. German pilots, who had grown used to easy kills against unescorted bombers, now found themselves in savage dogfights against an enemy that refused to leave. Colonel Don Blakesley, legendary commander of the 4th Fighter Group, led from the front in his personal P-51 named Shangri-La. His pilots, many of them former Eagle Squadron volunteers who had flown with the RAF, tore into the German formations with aggressive tactics. One Mustang pilot, Captain Don Gentile, racked up multiple kills in a single mission, his aircraft's guns glowing red from continuous fire. Another, Lieutenant Chuck Yeager, would later become famous, but on these early missions, he learned the Mustang's deadly grace firsthand. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by years of combat, began to crack under the pressure. Experienced German aces who had survived the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain watched in disbelief as their formations were shredded by the long-ranging Americans. Fuel shortages forced the Germans to commit novice pilots with barely 50 hours of training. The Mustangs exploited every advantage: superior high-altitude performance, better visibility from the bubble canopy, and the ability to loiter and pounce from above. By the end of Big Week, the Allies had flown over 3,000 bomber sorties and more than 6,000 fighter sorties. German aircraft production was crippled. More importantly, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and planes. The daylight skies over Germany were no longer a safe hunting ground for the defenders. The P-51 Mustang had proven itself beyond doubt. One test pilot's crazy idea had given the Allies the weapon they desperately needed at exactly the right moment. But the greatest test was still to come, when the Mustangs would fly all the way to Berlin and help deliver the final blows that would crush the Luftwaffe once and for all. March 6, 1944, 30,000 feet above Berlin. The German capital sprawls below under a thin haze of smoke and industrial smog. For the first time in the war, American heavy bombers are striking the heart of the Reich in broad daylight, and they are not alone. You can almost hear the collective gasp of German air defense commanders as their radar plots fill with hundreds of tiny blips. Not just the slow, vulnerable bomber stream, but a cloud of fast-moving fighters weaving protectively around them. The P-51 Mustangs have arrived where no escort fighter has ever dared venture before. Their Merlin engines purr with effortless power at altitude, the fighters riding high and ready, drop tanks already jettisoned, guns armed and hungry. The Luftwaffe scrambles everything it has left. Me-109s and FW-190s claw for altitude in desperate waves. Some still wear the proud markings of elite units like JG-27 and JG-52. Veteran pilots with scores of victories grip their sticks tighter, knowing this mission is different. Today, the Americans refuse to turn back at the border. Today, the hunters have become the hunted. The first clashes erupt like sudden thunder. A squadron of Mustangs, led by aggressive pilots from the 357th Fighter Group, the Yoxford Boys, spots a large gaggle of German fighters climbing from below. The P-51s roll inverted and dive, using their superior speed and energy to bounce the enemy from out of the sun. 6.5 caliber guns open up in long, disciplined bursts. Tracers streak across the cold blue sky. A FW-190 explodes in a fireball, its pilot barely managing to bail out. Another Me-109 sheds its wing under the hammering fire and spins earthward in a helpless spiral. Dogfights swirl across miles of sky. The Mustang's laminar wings and powerful Merlin allow it to outturn, outclimb, and outdive many of its opponents at altitude. German pilots who once mocked the Yankee crates now radio frantic warnings, "Achtung, Mustangs!" The sleek American fighters seem to be everywhere, covering the bombers, sweeping ahead to clear the path, then circling back to protect stragglers. Colonel Don Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group tears into another formation near the target area. Blakesley himself scores multiple victories that day, his voice calm over the radio, even as his guns blaze. Pilots like Major James Howard, who had already earned the Medal of Honor for single-handedly defending a bomber formation earlier in the campaign, now lead charges that shatter German cohesion. Below, the B-17s and B-24s unload their deadly cargo on Berlin's aircraft factories and rail yards. Flak bursts among them, but the fighter opposition is broken and scattered. For the first time, the bomber crews can actually see their escorts staying with them through the entire mission. Radio calls crackle with relief and gratitude. "Little friends, we see you!" By the time the formations turn west for home, the sky over Berlin belongs to the Allies. The Mustangs, low on ammunition but still full of fight, weave protective patterns until the last bomber crosses the Dutch coast. The Luftwaffe's losses that day are devastating. Dozens of experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft are gone. The once mighty Air Force that had terrorized Europe is hemorrhaging talent it can never replace. Fuel shortages, pilot inexperience, and relentless pressure from the long-ranging P-51s are combining into a death spiral. The air war had turned. One British test pilot's simple suggestion, swapping in the Merlin engine, had unlocked the Mustang's true potential. Now those Mustangs were not just escorting bombers, they were systematically destroying the Luftwaffe in its own backyard. The victories of Big Week and the first Berlin raids were only the beginning. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1944, the P-51 Mustang squadrons flew mission after mission, pushing deeper and staying longer. By D-Day on June 6th, the 8th Air Force and 9th Air Force owned the daylight skies over Normandy. German fighters that tried to interfere with the invasion fleets were met by swarms of Mustangs that refused to yield an inch of altitude or time. The Luftwaffe, already bled white, could barely put up coherent opposition. But the true death blow came in the weeks that followed. Mustang pilots developed new tactics tailored to their aircraft's strengths. They flew high cover, then dove to strafe German airfields when the bombers turned for home. Ground attack missions became deadly for the enemy. P-51s would roar in at treetop level, their 6.50 caliber guns chewing up parked aircraft, fuel dumps, and hangars. Runways that once launched hundreds of fighters now lay cratered and silent. Experienced German commanders like General Lieutenant Adolf Galland watched helplessly as their pilot training programs collapsed.
New Luftwaffe pilots were being sent into combat with less than 100 hours of flight time. Many had never even fired their guns in anger. Against battle-hardened Mustang pilots with superior machines, the mismatch was fatal. One after another, the great German aces fell. The Mustangs showed no mercy. In the air, the P-51's combination of speed, range, climb rate, and firepower proved almost unbeatable at the altitudes where the decisive battles were fought. On the ground, the constant threat of roaming Mustang rat hunts kept German planes hidden in forests and dispersed airfields, further reducing their effectiveness. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages had become critical. Many units were grounded for days at a time. The once proud fighter arm that had ruled from the English Channel to the gates of Moscow could no longer protect its own cities, its own factories, or its own armies. The psychological impact was devastating. German pilots who had once laughed at the flying milk bottle or the Yankee sport plane now feared the distinctive silhouette of the P-51 more than any other Allied aircraft. Captured Luftwaffe officers later admitted that the long-range Mustang escort was the single factor that broke the back of their air force. Meanwhile, across the English airfields, Mustang pilots painted victory markings on their cowlings with growing pride. Some aces, men like Don Gentile, Francis Gabby Gabreski, and George Preddy, ran up scores that rivaled the best German pilots of earlier years. The plane that had once seemed destined for obscurity had become the deadliest long-range escort fighter type of the war. And it had all started with one British test pilot's crazy idea in the spring of 1942. Ronnie Farker's suggestion to fit the Merlin engine turned a good fighter into a war-winning weapon at exactly the moment the Allies needed it most. Without that engine swap, the daylight bombing campaign might have failed. Without those deep escorts, the Luftwaffe might have survived long enough to contest D-Day or prolong the war in the West. The Mustang didn't win the war single-handedly, but it cleared the skies so that the bombers could destroy Germany's war industry, so that the armies could cross the Channel and march to the Rhine, and so that ultimate victory could come in the spring of 1945.